So let's just dive in. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to start just with that opening tracking shot that begins, inside a crowded ship, and
Right.
then it and then it slithers and snakes up to the deck where we're gazing at already kind of an iconic image
Right.
of the Statue of Liberty upside down. It's in the trailer. It's one of the first things everybody I know talks about after they see the movie. How did
Right.
that shot come together? How did you pull it off?
Okay. So, well, that's actually me operating a handheld camera, an ARRI 235 camera, which is the smallest sync sound 235, 35 mil camera that you operate. Um, Essentially, like a lot of these things, Brady has it's the third movie that I've shot for Brady. He's always had these very ambitious ideas. Sort of there's long Steadicam sequences in the film. This was one where he was like, I really want to start with Laszlo and embrace the idea of disorientation. So, uh, the shot evolves from Laszlo waking up to then coming down these steps, fighting his way with other immigrants in the bowels of the ship, as you've said. And then he's sort of drawn up towards the light, and it gets increasingly bright. And then this light, very powerful sunlight is streaming through the portholes. At one point, he even goes right up to the porthole and almost overexposes on his face. I was operating the camera on that, and it was basically, I think the final editorial version is an amalgamation of different takes, but essentially it was all shot in one continuous take. And I was handheld, and I was, imagine that the steps in a ship are very steep as well. So I was pulling myself up with one hand whilst operating, steadying the camera with the other, so and I love doing those kind of shots. They're incredibly exhilarating. There's an incredible connection between the actor and you in that moment, and it's really up to you. It's like you have to really be in sync, and it's a kind of call and response with the performance, and in that regard, it's an absolute pleasure to be asked to shoot a scene in that way, and you have this kind of exhilarating sense of self-protection in a way. Like once that camera's on your shoulder, you would kind of go anywhere with it. It's a really great thing. And that ship was moored on the river, on the Danube in Budapest, where we shot the movie. And Judy designed the interior of it. And the idea was that you kind of really don't see that much at the beginning, and it's just faces and snatches of Adrien in the light. And then, so I think it was very, very effective. And then as we get onto the deck of the ship, and again, it sort of overexposes, and Daniel's wonderful score kind of elevates. And then we pan off Adrien to find. I mean, there's obviously a stitch in there, but there's other photography that we then did in New York of the Statue of Liberty as it's kind of tumbling upside down, and that's how the sequence ends.
Yeah, I mean, you're really just talking about a massively ambitious opening shot that I think sets the tone of the whole movie. And Brady has been on the Q&A circuit,
Yes.
and he's often used this expression that the Brutalist is kind of a combination of minimalism and maximalism. And this
Yes.
is very much the latter. But
Yes.
every time I thought I knew what this movie's kind of visual language was, it would change on me. There'd be
Right.
extremely long monologues with a static camera, but then there'd be
Yes.
other scenes like the jazz club where the camera is just like unhinged. It's just wild. Can you just kind of talk about what that minimalism and maximalism meant to what you were doing as cinematographer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because talking of the minimalist, I mean, my sort of historically where I came from in filmmaking was working a lot with non-actors and available light. And certainly the first movie I ever shot, Ballast, was 35 mil available light, non-actors, that kind of thing. So in that regard, my photography, the thing I've always been drawn to is very much sort of less is more in one sense. I mean, I think there's, I'm talking about sort of like available light and things like this, and not working on stages, working in found locations and things like that. So that's been the thing that I've always been sort of drawn to. I think within this movie, I think there's a kind of commonality to the aesthetic, and there's a taste that Brady and I have where the lighting and things, even though there is a lot of lighting in the movie, I feel like the lighting is informed by a degree of naturalism or found lighting effects, if that makes sense, as opposed to, I'm not somebody who kind of like is incredibly impositional with my lighting. If I find a space and we respond to the space, then we try to respect that and respect the light that's there, and then, light that accordingly, and, in terms of the maximalism, I think it's really like, a case in point is like Brady is to the max in the sense of like his themes, he takes big swings, there's thematically, he's talking about antiquity versus modernity, all his the three movies that shot, they're the movies that you go to see and then sit in a bar afterwards and really talk about, it's not lowest common denominator filmmaking. It's let's talk about humanity and adult themes and the adult world, and that's the sort of films I like getting involved in, personally, where I'm like, okay, let's really think about this. And The Brutalist is that to the max. It's like two movies in one. I mean, it's kind of an epic. And so if you look at like the Carrera marble quarries, we're shooting VistaVision, we're seeing these massive kind of landscapes that have been kind of destroyed by mankind. I mean, their brutality personified, So in one hand, so there's that maximalism in there, and then there's also this kind of like intimate portrayal of these characters, and certainly of Laszlo, and very intimate moments where we're right up close and personal, and like for example, there's a very intimate moment, there's intimate lovemaking scenes, there's intimate scenes with Laszlo and his cousin and his wife that almost develop into this kind of suggestion of a menage a trois or something. It's quite but it's those scenes were a real delight to film, and they're very, very intimate moments within the film, so I think I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, we're talking about the epic and the intimate, and you brought up using VistaVision. And I was wondering how using a larger format version of 35 millimeter, where it's tilted, did that impact what you were doing in terms of kind of filming the epic and the intimate? Because, we sometimes have these gorgeous, although sometimes quite stark landscapes or depictions of cities, but sometimes the architecture could almost be like a human face, and we get very tight.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is about the VistaVision format is in essence, it allows you there's several things, but one is the resolution. Just, it's a bigger neg area. It's over twice the size of a standard 35 mil neg area. So you have a tighter resolution. But also you have this wonderful thing happening with the field of view. So normally if you're trying to shoot a wider angle, either of a building, of course, of architecture, or of a landscape, you're forced onto a wider angle lens, which has its inherent distortions. Like I was just looking earlier at the interiors of the Carrera quarry. And so instead of being forced onto like an 18 mil you can be working on like maybe a 25 or a 32 or something, because it essentially the focal length remains the same, but your field of view is so much bigger because you're capturing such a bigger area, so it has this absolute kind of majesty. But we also use the VistaVision on more intimate scenes, like when Laszlo meets his cousin in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. He steps off the bus and they have this incredibly emotional moment one of my favorite images of the movie that was shot VistaVision, you know. So, excuse me. So you can be up close and personal with this camera system. Yeah, it's an incredible. I mean, it's a technically challenging format, but the results are extraordinary, you know.
Well, you really feel it. And I wanted to ask because so much of the Brutalist plays such, careful, loving attention to shape and beauty. And I was just wondering how it impacted what you were doing because even in a recent Q&A, it was said that brutalist architecture even creates very cinematic light. So there's this idea that, the movie has to depict beauty and it's about beauty. So what was it like with Brady finding the right visual language to capture that on film?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's interesting because, architecture by definition, and certainly brutalist architecture, is a fairly inanimate thing to capture, you know. I mean, I think very early on we were really talking about what is it like to experience these spaces, you know? And I think that's what the film really seeks to do, you know, through Judy Becker's work and obviously Brady, and the performance was like, you know, a case in point is there's a moment in the concrete silo, like where the altarpiece is installed, you know, and that was this kind of found location in Budapest that Judy then reappropriated and redesigned. But it was very important to us that it was about, well, how does that feel? So the camera moves were very specific height, very specifically pushing into the space, tilting up, ascending. You see the light coming down too. It was like there was a lot of discussion about how do you move within that space? What does it feel like? You know, if that answers it.
Yeah, it does. I wanted to ask about influences because The Brutalist has been compared to so many other films, I think in a very positive way.
Yeah.
But I was at a Q&A earlier this year at the Music Box with Brady Corbet, and even he was like, we did not have any of those reference points in mind. They're flattering comparisons, but we didn't think about any of that stuff. So that begs the question, what were you guys thinking about? Was it other films? Was it painting? Was it photography?
Yeah, I mean, it from the moment that Brady approached me about the Brutalist after shooting Vox Lux together, you know. So we had a long period of conversation, you know, like he basically like this was a jumping off point, this book by Peter Chadwick that, you know, he gave me as a gift and said, listen, this is the next one, sort of thing, you know, which was wonderful. So obviously we looked at a lot of those you know, the work of those architects like Le Corbusier and Marcel Breuer and you know, Van der Rohe and people like that, you know, and also looking at like how those things are photographed, you know. I mean, they're such monolithic kind of structures, you know, in many ways, works of like great beauty. But you know, those were an obvious jumping off point, but we also looked at like, I mean, Brady and I, you know, through all three films, have always tried to sort of distress the film in some way. We love 35 mil, but if you're trying to shoot 35 mil for period, you also need to kind of like the film stocks and the lenses have become very precise over time, and often we're trying to create something that's much more impressionistic, you know. So most of the time we look back at paintings and things, you know, whether it's like Hopper, you know, or Otto Dix paintings, for example. Like that Otto Dix was an interesting reference in terms of the color for the scene where they're all dancing together that I spoke about earlier, you know, with Emma Laird in this wonderful red dress, you know. So you know, we were looking at those kind of paintings from the 1930s, and then like William Claxton's jazz photographs and things as inspiration for the jazz club scenes and things like that. And Saul Leiter, of course, for like the diner scene, you know. So there's a lot of more photography and paintings that would come in just as like maybe the night before or 2 days before. Brady would be like, hey, look at this, or I'd, you know, throw another idea out or something. So yeah, you know, I mean, there are definitely kind of Brady and I are both drawn to more, I think it's fair to say, more of a sort of historically European cinema, you know. And so I think we share a similar taste, you know. And so I think it's like we love naturalistic lighting. We don't like things to be like overly conscious of the lighting. We like to sort of be respectful of the spaces and the way that and also creating a space, lighting a space so the actors can move and perform within that space and things like that. I mean, there's lots of environments in this where I've had to light in, you know, 5-minute scenes. I've had to light them and allow the camera to roam around 360 and tumble around and then hide every light, you know. So it's been really, it was a technically challenging film in that respect, you know.
Well, you pulled it off. Congratulations. We're out of time, but it's one of the most beautiful films of the year. I'm excited for everybody to go be able to see it coming up in December. Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
You too. Thank you. Thanks, Brendan. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Really great movie, man. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.